In the depths of centuries, where history intertwines with legend and power begets both grandeur and tragedy, there are names that burn brighter than others, leaving behind a searing trail. One such name is Mary I Tudor, the first crowned Queen of England. But for posterity, she remained not just Mary, but Bloody Mary, a nickname whispered with a shudder, a name that became synonymous with religious intolerance and cruelty. Her 5-year reign, stained by the fire of stakes where people burned for their faith, forever inscribed her in the annals as a tragic, controversial figure, still provoking fervent debate. To understand this queen, one must not merely enumerate her deeds, but delve into the somber depths of her soul, comprehend the motives that drove her, and feel the pulse of an era when faith was not merely a conviction, but a matter of life and death. Mary's path to the throne was winding and thorny, marked by grandeur and humiliation, love and betrayal. She was born on February 18, 1516, the first child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and for a long time was the royal couple's only surviving child. Her birth was met with undisguised joy, for she was a precious princess, the hope for the continuation of the Tudor dynasty. Mary's childhood was spent in luxury and under close scrutiny. She was incredibly intelligent, diligent in her studies, proficient in Latin, Greek, French, and Spanish, and enjoyed music, playing the lute and harpsichord. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the greatest thinker of the Renaissance, spoke of her as a gifted and promising pupil. From an early age, Mary displayed a deep religiosity inherited from her mother, the devout Spanish princess, daughter of the Catholic monarchs. Her tutors, among whom were famous scholars, instilled in her a devotion to the Roman Catholic Church, which would become the cornerstone of her worldview and destiny. She was declared heir to the throne, but this title, which seemed unshakable, proved as fragile as an autumn leaf. Clouds began to gather over her head when her father, Henry VIII, obsessed with the idea of having a male heir and enamored with the young lady-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn, decided to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The king's great matter, as this drama, which spanned years and forever altered the course of English history, was called. Pope Clement VII, fearing Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew, refused the annulment. In response, Henry, hitherto proclaimed the defender of the faith, broke with Rome, declared himself head of the Church of England, and married Anne Boleyn. For Mary, this period became an unbearable torment. She was declared illegitimate, stripped of all her titles, separated from her mother whom she adored, and exiled from court. Her very existence was called into question by the Act of Succession of 1534, which recognized Henry and Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, as the heir. Her refusal to acknowledge her parents' divorce and her father's supremacy over the church was perceived as defiance of the crown. Mary spent several years in isolation, subjected to pressure, an attempt to force her to renounce her faith and acknowledge the legitimacy of her father's new marriage. This was a time of deep personal trauma that shaped her character. She became stubborn, suspicious, yet unyielding in her convictions. Anne Boleyn's death in 1536 gave Mary a brief reprieve and an opportunity for a partial reconciliation with her father, but only after she, under duress, signed a document acknowledging the illegitimacy of her parents' marriage and Henry's supremacy as head of the church. This was a deep internal contradiction, a wound that never healed. With each new marriage of Henry's and each new child, first Elizabeth, then Edward, Mary's position remained uncertain. But by the end of Henry's reign, by the Act of Succession of 1544, she was restored to the line of succession after Edward and before Elizabeth. Nevertheless, her Catholic faith remained unshakable, becoming for her not just a conviction, but an anchor of salvation in the turbulent waters of political intrigue and personal humiliation. By 1553, the young King Edward VI's health rapidly deteriorated. Understanding that his death would lead to the ascent of Mary, a fervent Catholic, the Duke of Northumberland, driven by the desire to maintain Protestant power and strengthen his own influence, persuaded the dying king to alter the order of succession. Under the new act, Mary and Elizabeth were excluded from the list of heirs, and the throne was to be inherited by Lady Jane Grey, Henry VIII's great-niece and wife of Northumberland's son. This conspiracy was a daring attempt on lawful succession and was intended to permanently establish Protestantism in England. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553. News of his demise and Lady Jane's appointment as queen was kept secret for several days. Mary, residing at Hunsdon Hall, was warned of the conspiracy and fled to East Anglia, a traditionally Catholic region. There she began to gather supporters, relying on the legitimacy of her claim to the throne, which had been confirmed by Henry VIII's Parliament. Mary's appeal to the people was simple and powerful. She was the rightful heir, overthrown for the ambitions of a powerful duke. This proved sufficient. Within days, thousands of supporters flocked to Mary, and forces loyal to the crown switched to her side. The support was so overwhelming that the Duke of Northumberland was forced to abandon his plans. Lady Jane Grey, who had reigned for only 9 days, was deposed. On August 3, 1553, Mary Tudor triumphantly entered London, where she was met by jubilant crowds. The people saw in her a savior from the tyranny of the regents, a rightful queen returning home. At the moment Mary sat on the throne, it seemed that an era of stability and justice would finally arrive. Her ascent was not merely a political upheaval, but a true act of popular will, tired of constant changes and desiring a return to traditional order. Mission of life: returning England to the fold of Rome. For Mary, her ascension to the throne was not just a personal triumph, but a divine preordainment. She saw herself as chosen by God, called to rectify the sins of her father, Henry VIII, and to return England to the fold of the Roman Catholic Church. This was a deep, almost mystical conviction, forged by decades of humiliation, exile, and fidelity to the sole truth as she understood it. England was afflicted with heresy, and Mary believed that only a return to the true faith could save its soul and its people. Mary's first steps in religious policy were cautious but resolute. Immediately after her coronation, she repealed all Protestant laws passed during Edward VI's reign. The Latin Mass was restored. Married priests were expelled from their parishes, and a process of returning to traditional Catholic rites was initiated. Bishops who had been imprisoned for their faith under Edward were freed and reinstated in their dioceses, while many Protestant bishops were arrested. The culmination of this process was the Great Act of Repeal of 1554, passed by Parliament. This act repealed all anti-papal laws passed since 1929, including Henry VIII's Act of Supremacy. England officially returned under the jurisdiction of the Pope. This symbolic act was cemented by the return of Cardinal Reginald Pole, the Pope's legate to England, who solemnly absolved England of its sins on behalf of the Holy See. For Mary, this was a moment of supreme happiness, the embodiment of her most cherished dream. She believed that she had thereby atoned for the guilt of her country and her family before God. However, the return to Catholicism was not universally met with enthusiasm. Although many English people, especially in the North and West, welcomed the return of old traditions, in London and the southeastern counties where Protestantism had taken deep root, unrest began. Protestant preachers, many of whom had lived in exile, returned and began clandestine activities, while those who remained in England continued to secretly practice their faith. Mary perhaps underestimated how deeply Protestant ideas had permeated society during the reigns of her father and brother. The Spanish marriage, a shadow on the Queen's reputation. One of Mary's key decisions, which had fatal consequences for her reputation and reign, was her marriage. At 37, she remained unmarried, and ensuring a Catholic succession and the birth of an heir was a paramount task. Mary rejected English suitors, fearing they would be too domineering and would limit her sovereign rights. Her choice fell upon Philip II, Prince of Spain, son of the powerful Emperor Charles V, and her cousin. This decision provoked a storm of indignation in England. Society feared the loss of independence and the transformation of England into a Spanish province. Spain was the greatest power of the time, a bastion of Catholicism, but also an object of national suspicion. The English feared that their country would be drawn into Spain's continental wars and English wealth would be depleted for the benefit of a foreign crown. Fear of the Spanish marriage sparked Wyatt's rebellion in January 1554. The rebellion, which began as a protest against the marriage, quickly acquired a religious and political character, aiming to depose Mary and enthrone her half-sister Elizabeth. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, but its consequences were tragic. For Mary, this was proof of the Protestant threat and confirmation of the need for harsh measures. As a result of this rebellion, although Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower, her life hanging by a thread, the main victims were Lady Jane Grey and her husband, Lord Guilford Dudley. They were executed on February 12, 1554, as their existence was considered a constant threat to Mary's throne. The marriage to Philip II took place in July 1554. It was a joyless ceremony, overshadowed by political tension. Philip, a devout Catholic and pragmatic politician, understood the importance of this union, but showed no personal affection for Mary, who was 11 years his senior. His frequent absences from England, his coldness and neglect deeply wounded Mary, who had genuinely fallen in love with him. The marriage never produced the much-desired heir. Mary experienced 2 phantom pregnancies, when her body displayed all the signs of pregnancy, but no birth followed. These false hopes and subsequent disappointments undermined her health and morale, leaving her in a state of deep depression. The failure to produce an heir meant that, after her death, the throne would pass to Elizabeth, which was Mary's greatest nightmare, the collapse of her entire mission to restore England to Catholicism. The flames of the Inquisition, the birth of Bloody Mary. The bloody imprint on the history of Mary I was left by her persecution of Protestants, which began in 1555. Prior to this, for 18 months, despite the return to Catholicism, penalties for heresy had been relatively mild, mostly fines, deprivation of office, or short imprisonments. However, the failure of the marriage, the suppressed Wyatt rebellion, and most importantly, Mary's unyielding conviction that heresy was not merely an error, but a mortal sin threatening the very soul of England, led to a tightening of policy. Mary, being the daughter of her era, believed that heresy was not only an affront to God, but also an undermining of state stability. In her eyes, Protestants were not merely lost sheep, but dangerous rebels, threatening the divine order. The revival of the Heresy Acts in 1554, under which heresy was punishable by death by burning, became a turning point.
For the queen who saw herself as executing God's will, the burning of heretics was not an act of vengeance, but an act of purification and salvation of souls, as well as a preventative measure to stop the spread of the contagion. The first executions began in February 1555. John Rogers, a priest who had translated the Bible, became the first martyr. Others followed. The flames of the stakes flared across England, but raged particularly in London and the southeastern counties, where Protestantism was strongest. The executions were public, spectacular, intended to terrify and suppress dissent. However, instead of intimidating, they often aroused sympathy for the victims and revulsion toward the authorities. The courage with which many Protestants met their deaths inspired others and created an aura of martyrdom around their faith. Among the most famous victims were former bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, burned at Oxford in October 1555. Latimer's words, addressed to Ridley at the stake, became a symbol of Protestant resistance. "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." These words portended the future. The most famous victim was Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, who was the chief ideologue of the English Reformation under Henry VIII and Edward VI. Under pressure and in hopes of a pardon, Cranmer signed several recantations of his Protestant beliefs. However, Mary had no intention of pardoning him, desiring a public recantation followed by execution to demonstrate that even the most high-ranking heretic would not escape punishment. At the last moment, standing at the stake in March 1556, Cranmer renounced his recantations, declaring that his hand, which had signed them, should be the first to burn. He held his hand in the flames until it was charred, before the fire engulfed him completely. It was a spectacle that shook many and transformed Cranmer into one of the greatest Protestant martyrs. During Mary I's 5-year reign, over 280 Protestants were sent to the stake. Among them were not only clergy, but also ordinary people, artisans, peasants, women, and even teenagers. These executions were unprecedented in scale in England. No monarch before or after her resorted to such mass persecutions for religious motives. This policy was not only the result of Mary's deep faith, but also of her despair, her conviction that only such radical measures could cleanse England of heresy and save its soul. However, in the end, it led to the exact opposite result. Calais, the last drop of bitterness. In addition to religious persecutions, Mary I's reign was overshadowed by failures in foreign policy and economic difficulties. Loyal to her husband, Philip II, Mary drew England into a war with France, supporting Spain. This war proved catastrophic. In January 1558, after a prolonged siege, the English lost Calais, England's last continental enclave, which had been under English control for over 200 years. The loss of Calais was a devastating blow to national pride and to Mary's personal state. For her, as for many English people, Calais was a symbol of England's greatness, a legacy of the 100 Years' War victories. Its loss was not merely a military defeat, but a deep humiliation that Mary perceived as a personal tragedy. "When I am dead, you will find Calais engraved upon my heart," she famously said. The country's economic situation was also difficult. Several consecutive bad harvests led to food shortages and rising prices. Epidemics of influenza and other diseases ravaged the population, exacerbating the overall depressive atmosphere. All these factors, religious persecutions, an unhappy marriage, military defeats, and economic difficulties, created an image of an unfortunate and ineffective reign. The Queen's decline and the birth of a legend. Mary's health, already undermined by constant stress, phantom pregnancies, and depression, rapidly deteriorated. She suffered from illnesses that contemporaries described as dropsy, possibly a tumor mimicking pregnancy. By 1558, it became clear that the queen was dying, and the chances of bearing an heir were nil. In the last months of her life, Mary experienced unbearable suffering. Her deep faith gave her no peace. She saw that her mission to return England to Catholicism was failing. She had to accept the inevitable. Her heir would be Elizabeth, a Protestant, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the very woman for whom her mother had been humiliated and she herself declared illegitimate. This was the greatest defeat of her life, the collapse of all her hopes and efforts. Mary I Tudor died on November 17, 1558, at the age of 42 at St. James's Palace. A few hours later, on the same day, her loyal associate, Cardinal Reginald Pole, also died, which many perceived as a sign from above. Upon ascending the throne, Elizabeth I immediately began to reverse Mary's religious reforms, definitively establishing Protestantism in England. Mary's death did not bring her peace. Her name was forever tainted by the nickname Bloody Mary. This epithet was not coined during the Reformation era. It became attached to her later, in the 17th century, when England's Protestant identity was firmly established, and any attempt at Catholic resurgence was perceived as a mortal threat. Protestant historians and pamphleteers such as John Foxe, in his Book of Martyrs, meticulously documented the atrocities of her reign, portraying Mary as a cruel fanatic, a monster craving blood. However, history, like the human soul, is far more complex. Mary I Tudor was not merely a bloody queen. She was a deeply religious woman, traumatized by a difficult childhood, fanatically devoted to her faith, who saw herself as an instrument of divine providence. Her actions were not dictated by personal malice, but by an unshakable conviction in the righteousness of her mission, in that she was saving the souls of her subjects from eternal damnation. In the context of the 16th century, when religious wars tore Europe apart and heresy was equated with treason, her actions, though they seem inhumane to us, were entirely justified in the eyes of many contemporaries. The Inquisition operated across Europe, and the burning of heretics was a common practice for both Catholics and Protestants, although the latter usually executed by hanging or beheading. Nevertheless, Mary's methods proved counterproductive. Instead of extinguishing Protestantism, she merely strengthened it, creating a pantheon of martyrs and sowing deep hatred for Catholicism in English society. Her reign became a dark stain on the history of the Tudor dynasty, a symbol of religious fanaticism and human tragedy. Ultimately, Bloody Mary is not just a queen, but a tragic symbol of an era when faith was a weapon and convictions cost lives. Her story is a warning of what absolute certainty in one's righteousness and intolerance of dissent can lead to. Behind the lyrical veil of her suffering, despair, and deep faith lies the harsh truth that even the noblest, at first glance, intentions can lead to the most terrible consequences, leaving behind not light, but only the searing smoke of stakes and an ominous nickname echoing through the ages.